It's a revolution.
This video is based on the book Capitalist Realism by the late Mark Fisher. Fisher defines capitalist realism as, quote, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. He begins with the quote, often attributed to Slavoj Žižek, that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. The rest of the book delves into why this is the case. Fisher believes, quote, the power of capitalist realism derives in part from the way that capitalism subsumes and consumes all of previous history, and can assign all cultural objects, whether they are religious iconography, pornography, or Das Kapital, a monetary value. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write that our culture has been consumed by commodification, which is the face of ruthless exploitation of capitalism. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union and Maoist China were referred to as really existing socialism. They might not have fit with the historical definition of socialism, but it was all the left had to hang their hat on outside of capitalism. The 1980s also saw the belief in socialist realism. The Soviet Union had grown rapidly, giving credence to central planning, and many saw the math that the workers outnumbered the bosses and would eventually overthrow them as an inevitability. Fisher says that Margaret Thatcher's breaking of the miners' strike in 1984 and 1985 in Britain was a crucial part of the development of capitalist realism. As she ushered in neoliberalism, Thatcher famously said, quote, there is no alternative.
I will never negotiate with people who use coercion and violence to achieve their objective. They are the enemies of democracy. They are not interested in the future of democracy. They are trying to kill democracy for their own purposes.
Since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the liberalization of China, Western capitalism was faced with a problem of what to do without a threat of an enemy out there. When the Berlin Wall fell, political scientist Francis Fukuyama gave a speech in which he declared the end of history, where capitalist democracy had triumphed over all other systems and no further social progress was necessary. Badiou says that capitalism is a contradiction, in which the ruling class tell us, quote, we may not live in a condition of perfect goodness, but we're lucky we don't live in a condition of evil. Our democracy is not perfect, but it's better than the bloody dictatorships. Capitalism is unjust, but it's not criminal like Stalinism. Frederick Jameson calls postmodernism, quote, the cultural logic of late capitalism, a philosophy that is the product of a system it attempts to critique. Even protest against the system has been co-opted by it. Fisher states, nothing runs better on MTV than a protest against MTV. Gangster rap is another example of capitalist realism, something that pretends to go against the system but is intimately a part of it. Both Fisher and Žižek point out that in literature, film, and culture, there are many anti-capitalist themes embedded in capitalism. The evil corporation is common in cinema. Fisher gives the example of the Disney movie Wall-E. Humans have trashed Earth's environment, and people have become lazy, mindless consumers on a spaceship. The resolution is to fix and return to Earth, but they never overcome capitalism, only minimize its most egregious side effects. Fisher says, quote, the film performs our anti-capitalism for us, allowing us to continue to consume with impunity. In other words, capitalism has managed to commodify resistance to capitalism. Fisher describes the moral consciousness of late capitalism by saying, quote, so long as we believe in our hearts that capitalism is bad, we are free to continue to participate in capitalist exchange. The book describes Bono's Product Red as, quote, realistic acceptance that capitalism is the only game in town. Neoliberalism has brought what Fisher calls a business ontology, which means that everything in society, even education and healthcare, should be run like a business. Fisher writes, capitalist realism insists on treating mental health as if it were a natural fact, like weather. In The Selfish Capitalist, Oliver James wrote that mental health issues are highest in countries where neoliberalism has most accelerated. This is confirmed by the research in the book The Spirit Level. Fisher calls this, quote, the privatization of stress. He says that many of his students are under the condition of what he calls depressive hedonia, which he defines as, quote, an inability to do anything else except pursue pleasure. He says they live lives of soft narcosis, comfort food oblivion of PlayStation, all-night TV, and marijuana.
A bag of weed, oh, everything is better with a bag of weed. It's the only help that you'll ever need, because everything is better with a bag of weed.
Fisher states, quote, to be bored simply means to be removed from the communicative sensation stimulus matrix of texting, YouTube, and fast food, to be denied for a moment the constant flow of sugary gratification on demand. Deleuze and Guattari argued that schizophrenia was a condition on the outskirts of capitalism, while Marazzi argues that bipolar disorder is a condition central to capitalism. Mania represents the irrational exuberance of the market, while a downturn for the market or a person is called depression. Fisher states, without delirium and confidence, capital could not function. Frederick Jameson believes that the skyrocketing rates of mental illness are due to a system that promises us we can be anything we want and then blames us when we inevitably fail. We know that depression is in part caused by low serotonin levels, but Fisher asks, what still needs to be explained is why particular individuals have low serotonin levels. Adam Curtis said, what people suffer from is being trapped within themselves. In a world of individualism, everyone is trapped in their own feelings, trapped within their own imaginations. Fisher calls the bureaucracy of late capitalism, quote, market Stalinism, saying, an essential dimension of Stalinism was inhibited by its association with a social project like socialism, and can only emerge in late capitalist culture in which images acquire an autonomous force. The fact that massive bureaucracy has become part of late capitalism tells us that the reality of neoliberalism is different from its promise. The movie Office Space is an example of administrative anti-production.
You physically take the specs from the customer?
Well, no, my secretary does that.
Fisher calls reality TV in which viewers can take polls that change the show, quote, hyper-reality, borrowing from Jean Baudrillard. He says that TV's Big Brother has superseded Orwell's Big Brother.
How I must behave.
I feel sorry for you.
Oh,
I
I'm
feel
sorry for you,
sorry
pathetic little
just.
girl.
In a world where workers give themselves reviews, Fisher states that this is a, quote, postmodern capitalist version of Maoist confessionalism, in which workers are required to engage in constant symbolic self-denigration.
I just stare at my desk, but it looks like I'm working. I do that for probably another hour after lunch, too. I'd say in a given week, I probably only do about 15 minutes of real, actual work.
The waitress's flair in Office Space points out hidden expectations in the corporate world.
Do it. All right? There's my flair, okay? And this is me expressing myself, okay?
While reality is often something solid, capitalist realism asks us to accept a reality that is amorphous and constantly changing. Fisher says that workers must disinvest themselves from tasks that are, quote, pointless and demoralizing in order to do them. Fisher believes the philosopher most embodied by late capitalism is Max Stirner, more so than Adam Smith or F.A. Hayek. This is because Stirner saw society and the public sphere as a spook, existing only in our imaginations. Mike Davis wrote in 1992, quote, there is no light left to cast shadows, and evil becomes a forensic banality. He called the modern era a supersaturation of corruption that fails any longer to outrage or even interest. The book argues the fact that capitalism has colonized the dreaming life of the population is so taken for granted that it is no longer worthy of comment. Fisher states, quote, capitalist realism can only be threatened if it is shown to be in some way inconsistent or untenable. If, that is to say, capitalism's ostensible realism turns out to be nothing of the sort. He writes, capitalism is a hyper-abstract, impersonal structure that would be nothing without our cooperation. As a challenge to realism, Fisher states that the New Deal era contained its own realism, and neoliberalism with its union-busting and privatizations seemed impossible until it came. Alenka Zupancic states that the reality principle is, quote, the highest form of ideology, the ideology that presents itself as empirical fact. We see this in responses to those who dare question capitalism, with throwaway lines like, "learn economics," or something about Venezuela. Fisher writes, "If the real is unbearable, any reality we construct must be a tissue of inconsistencies. When things go wrong, rarely is the finger pointed at business, but rather it goes to government. When blame does go on business, as it did during the 2008 collapse, focuses on individual capitalists or bad apples, but never capitalism as a system." Fisher writes, "At the level of the political unconscious, it is impossible to accept that there are no overall controllers, that the closest thing we have to ruling powers are now nebulous, unaccountable interests exercising corporate irresponsibility."
There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today. The world is a business, Mr. Beale.
So what is the solution to capitalist realism? How do we break the spell of market ideology? The left's ability to answer this question will determine our fate and our future.